topic we have this week with Sabbath. Now, this biblical theme definitely deserves its own series, but I think the Bible Project crew have done a fantastic job of summarising the important points for us. So to follow up, I'm just going to walk through a couple of points and hopefully help us to work out how this theme practically applies to our lives today. So you might be working out that there are lots of things we could say about the Sabbath, and it is woven fairly thoroughly through the Bible story. So I'm just going to summarise what I find important with three aspects of the practice. So Sabbath is part of God's rhythm and story, Sabbath is an expression of God's economy, and Sabbath is God's gift to humanity. So we start with the idea that Sabbath is part of God's rhythm and story. In Genesis, we learn the flow of God's creation rhythm, and that after 6 days, the heavens and earth were finished, and all the host of them. And on the seventh day, God finished the work that he had done, and he rested on the seventh day from all his work that he had done. So God blessed the seventh day and made it holy, because on it God rested from all his work that he had done in creation. So at the very beginning of the Bible, we hear the story of how God created the earth and filled it with his creation. At the completion of this work, God rests. This may seem like a strange choice of words. I mean, we can hardly say that God gets tired. But the Hebrew word that we translate as rested is Shabbat, which means to cease. Later in the book of Exodus, we read of God handing down the law to Moses. And in instituting the Sabbath law, God explains that in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea and all that is in them, and rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and he made it holy. The word translated here as rested is the Hebrew word nuach, which means to take up residence. In these accounts of the creation story and God's rest, we find a more complete picture when we read them together. It wasn't simply that God stopped work and took a nap. Rather, God finished creating and then filled that whole creation with his presence, residing in the world he had created. Now, it's interesting to note the timeline in Genesis and realise that God actually created humanity on the 6th day. This means he rested and was present with his creation, including Adam and Eve, for a full day. God works and then rests, but for Adam and Eve, their first experience of life is this time of rest and living in God's presence. As author Jefferson Bethke says, God did all the work and Adam got to start with rest. Only after Adam had been properly filled could he live up to his vocation as a garden cultivating image bearer. The rhythm of God's story is one of resting and reveling in God's presence, filling us with the life and inspiration we need in order to live out our kingdom calling. Now, the second point is that Sabbath is an expression of God's economy. When God handed down the law to Moses, he included the institution of Sabbath as a day to remember and keep holy. And as we've heard in the Bible Project video, the people of Israel were to practice Sabbath weekly, as well as a Sabbath year after 6 years of work, and a year of Jubilee after 7 Sabbath years. It's an important practice because it was a day or a year to stop, to rest, and to enjoy God's good world. And part of enjoying this practice was the knowledge and trust of God's provision during the times of ceasing. As many of us are currently experiencing, ceasing work comes with uncertainty, as we also cease to gain the things that we need: food, goods, income, or services that we need to survive. Taking time off is a lot easier when you are assured that while you're not working, you will still have everything you need. So Sabbath is not only an opportunity to spend time in the presence of God, but to recognise the work God does on our behalf and how he takes care of us. A wonderful example of this is the story of God providing manna for the people of Israel while they're in the wilderness. This story can be found in Exodus 16. The people of Israel had been liberated out of Egypt, but after a while they became anxious and frustrated by their situation. They complained because they lacked food to eat, and they thought, well, you know what, we'd be better off as slaves back in Egypt. Now, God promises to look after his people, but he also provides some guidelines for how they can look after the gifts that he gives them. We pick up this story in Exodus 16:16, where God explains the gathering of manna, which is the food that he has provided. This is what the Lord has commanded. Gather of it each one of you as much as he can eat. You shall each take an omer according to the number of the persons that each of you has in his tent. And the people of Israel did so. They gathered, some more, some less. But when they measured it with an omer, whoever gathered much had nothing left over, and whoever gathered little had no lack. Each of them gathered as much as they could eat. And Moses said to them, "Let no one leave any of it over till the morning." But they did not listen to Moses. Some left part of it till the morning, and it bred worms and stank. And Moses was angry with them. Morning by morning they gathered it, each as much as he could eat. But when the sun grew hot, it melted. On the 6th day they gathered twice as much bread, 2 omers each. And when all the leaders of the congregation came and told Moses, he said to them, "This is what the Lord has commanded. Tomorrow is a day of solemn rest, a holy Sabbath to the Lord. Bake what you will bake and boil what you will boil, and all that is left over lay aside to be kept till the morning." So they laid it aside till the morning as Moses commanded them, and it did not stink, and there were no worms in it. Moses said, "Eat it today, for today is a Sabbath to the Lord. Today you will not find it in the field. 6 days you shall gather it, but on the 7th day, which is a Sabbath, there will be none." On the 7th day some of the people went out to gather, but they found none. And the Lord said to Moses, "How long will you refuse to keep my commandments and my laws? See, the Lord has given you the Sabbath. Therefore on the 6th day he gives you bread for 2 days. Remain each of you in his place. Let no one go out of his place on the 7th day." So the people rested on the 7th day. Now it's important to note here that this is before God has given the law to his people. There's been no formal institution of the Sabbath in the law and covenant. Yet they're aware of this day and this rhythm and are being called to observe it. In doing so, the people don't need to worry about having food that day, as God provides enough for a double portion to be collected on the 6th day, in anticipation of Shabbat, of ceasing. Notice too how this is intrinsically tied with only taking what is needed. The Sabbath is the only day when the manna remains fresh and edible overnight. If the people tried to hoard this food during the week and only keep it for themselves, the manna would rot and smell. God's economy is one of provision for the needs of each person and not for their excess. And Sabbath then is a practice of equity and justice. We see this reflected later in the law when the people of Israel partake in the Sabbath year and Jubilee. Land to be returned to its original owner, debt is to be forgiven, and slaves are to be set free. This is a picture of what the Bible later describes as the kingdom of God. To practice Sabbath then is to trust in God's provision for us while holding what he provides loosely and recognising that it has always and will continue to belong to God and not to us. Finally, we receive Sabbath as God's gift to humanity. With all of the discussion around Sabbath being an institution and part of God's law, it can be easy to forget that it is actually about entering into relationship with God. We can get stuck thinking of Sabbath as something we have to do, a ritual that comes with a set of rules and restrictions. One could even argue that keeping the Sabbath is a law for the Jewish people to follow and doesn't really apply to Christians as we're Gentiles. Even Jesus and Paul did not expect the Gentile believers to adhere to Jewish law. Yet there's still so much value to be found in this practice, and we can hardly deny its worth in our lives. Knowing the purpose and the reason why God calls us to enter Sabbath rest can help to take away some of the legalism that might surround this practice. But it's also helpful to know that Sabbath is a gift that God has given us in order that we might freely experience the rest and rhythm that he is able to offer. Now, Jesus contended with some of this legalistic thinking around Sabbath, and he was accused of breaking the law when he and his disciples plucked grain from a field in order to eat on Sabbath and healed a man's withered hand on Sabbath as well. So in Matthew 12, we find these stories, and we also find Jesus' response to the Pharisees' accusations. The Pharisees were the lawmakers at the time. So Jesus says in verse 5 of Matthew 12, "Have you not read in the law how on the Sabbath the priests in the temple profane the Sabbath and are guiltless? I tell you, something greater than the temple is here. And if you had known what this means, I desire mercy and not sacrifice, you would not have condemned the guiltless. For the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath." And later in verse 11, "Which one of you who has a sheep, if it falls into a pit on the Sabbath, will not take hold of it and lift it out? Of how much more value is a man than sheep? So it is lawful to do good on the Sabbath." In the book of Mark, these stories record Jesus saying also that the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. And this is a clear declaration of the purpose and intent of participating in Sabbath. Jesus is reminding his audience about the spirit of Sabbath. It's about being in the presence of God and celebrating his justice, mercy, and provision for us. The priests work in the temple on Sabbath and they are guiltless. And Jesus says, isn't it better to heal and to save, even if that means working on Sabbath? Jesus quotes Hosea, who prophesies in the Old Testament that it is better to show love, loyalty, and mercy than to bring only burnt offerings and sacrifices to God. The spirit of Sabbath, along with the rest of the law and the covenant, is about honouring God in love rather than simply fulfilling the letter of law without love. Jewish scholar Matityahu Tsevat says that keeping the Sabbath is acceptance of the kingdom and sovereignty of God. Now, surely this is as true for us Christian Gentiles as it is for Jewish believers. To keep the ritual practice of Sabbath means nothing unless it finds its purpose in Jesus. When Jesus came to earth, lived, died, and was raised to new life, he completed our understanding of Sabbath and what it means to enter into true rest. He opened the door to new life and new rest and ushered in a new kingdom that we can experience today. Imagine what it would be like to set aside a whole day to rest in God's presence, to enjoy his provision and to practice deep trust, to live in the kingdom of God and enjoy the good gifts that he gives us. What might that look like for you? Sabbath is not just an interesting concept or an obsolete law, but it is a chance to accept the kingdom and sovereignty of God and to live as though our ultimate rest has already come. How can you do this in your life today?